Anyone who plays horror games knows they're in for a specifically tailored experience. Something that a team of talented designers lovingly crafted and spent years of their lives on, as well as often millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars to artfully create a game for a very specific audience. They spend years refining the gameplay, implementing unique AI for their often varied types of enemies encountered throughout, and place the utmost respect into the crispiest of graphics that immerse you in a world you're about to explore. These people, such as the dark minds behind Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Alien Isolation, or the subject of today's video, Dead Space, are complete psychopaths. Horror games are very stressful experiences. This is done by design, and the best of the best ensure that you are having a horrible time throughout the entire game. This is great. In fact, it's the entire point of the game, to scare the shit out of you, to make sure that you're constantly uneasy and your heart is working overtime whilst you make your way through whatever god-awful situation you've been forced into. It's all the same reason people will sit down and watch 7 Conjurings or gag and feel sick whilst watching gorefests like The Terrifier, and then call it the best movie of their lives. We're all masochists deep down. In this video, I wanted to showcase some horror games in a kind of belated Halloween special, because frankly, I was too caught up replaying the Dragon Age games to get this video done in time for October. This video will also touch lightly on video game remakes, specifically horror games, since they seem to just be all the rage these days. So every year in October, I like to pick one horror game to focus on for the month. Horror games are quite linear in design and paced very nicely to just jump in for an hour, fight some kind of monstrosity or get chased around by a big man in a black trench coat. This year for Halloween, I wanted to play the Silent Hill 2 remake. But, as I'm a sucker for a good deal, I couldn't pass up an opportunity to grab the Dead Space remake for half price when I saw it. So now, here I am, with 2 critically acclaimed horror game remakes to sink my teeth into. So you just know that I've been on edge looking around corners for the past month. I started with the Dead Space remake by EA Motive, hence the focus of this video, and after playing through the entire story, I'm left horribly disturbed by the 12 or so hours of being chased around by Cronenberg flesh monsters. Dead Space is a visually disturbing experience, not unlike Silent Hill 2 or Resident Evil's usual uncomfortable creatures and whatnots that just won't leave you alone. But Dead Space shakes it up a bit by setting things up far beyond the stars, where really no one can hear you scream. So sit back, put your phone into stasis, and make sure you've got your plasma cutter ready, because we're about to take a trip through the USG Ishimura. When it comes to Dead Space, there's a lot to cover, and just about all of it is horrible. I will refrain from as many story spoilers as possible, because I'm mainly focusing on the gameplay and the art design aspects, but still take this as your spoiler warning. During the first Dead Space, you play as Isaac Clarke, an engineer assigned to a team who are checking out what's happening on the USG Ishimura, a mining vessel positioned over Aegis 7 that's come across an interesting discovery. When you arrive, there's no contact from the ship, and no one is waiting for you when you come aboard. There's already something clearly wrong as soon as you step foot aboard the Ishimura. The Ishimura itself is large, very large in fact, and you'll be spending about 95% of the game in and around, or on that later, the Ishimura. So as you can expect, there's not exactly any way to escape easily. The story moves quickly in Dead Space, so it's not long before something large and grotesque attacks your team and starts killing. Necromorphs, which are weird space zombie parasite things with elongated limbs and a general Cronenberg vibe about them, have claimed dominion over the Ishimura, and they're going to be on your ass from this point onwards until the end of the game. The Necromorphs suck in their own variety of ways, but we'll talk about them soon enough. I'm just introducing them to help set the vibe. Since the Ishimura has been overrun by these beasts, the ship is frankly in a shocking state. A large factor in what makes horror games disturbing is the environment. The context clues and the environmental storytelling do a lot to set the mood throughout the game, and the mood's not great. Aboard the Ishimura, there isn't really much that hasn't been affected in some way by the Necromorphs, whether it be the smeared blood in almost every room and hallway, or the bits and pieces of person littered all over the place. Not all of this is the direct fault of the necromorphs, as you'll learn throughout the course of Dead Space's story. The experience with something called the Marker, an extraterrestrial beacon found on Aegis 7, has driven the crew of the Ishimura quite insane. Now, we're talking sacrifices of the humankind, people cut up into just enough pieces for a lovely little ritual. My point is, wherever you go on the Ishimura, it's just purely uncomfortable. There is nothing pleasant about your time aboard this ship. If one isn't already in a room when you enter, it is possible for necromorphs to break into the room and attack you, and they often do, admittedly. They do this by smashing through vents on the walls, and these vents are very common aboard the Ishimura. In fact, there's one every few meters or so. This means that in every room you enter, so long as there's a vent, there's a chance of a necromorph, or 2, or 5, can make its way through and jump you. And there's a pretty good chance this will happen. Often, as well. Dead Space plays on this by placing valuable items such as ammo and healing kits right in front of these vents, daring you to risk it. In my experience, this was a fake out a lot of the time. Nothing jumped me as I collected my loots, it just very much made me reconsider, knowing that a necromorph could burst forth and charge me. It's not just the visuals that are disturbing. As many horror fans will know, the sounds are just as key to tying the whole experience together. Whilst you make your way, either carefully or, in my case, in a panicked frenzy sprinting about the place, you'll constantly hear necromorphs moving about the place as well as they make their way towards you. Talking about the Ishimura's necromorph vents again, I noticed that the audio cues of the necromorphs clambering around would conveniently begin to play as I approached some of these vents, which I already knew ran the risk of spawning a necromorph in my head. Whether this was done intentionally, and I'm gonna hazard a guess and say it was done intentionally, it still created a general, just fucking annoying vibe whilst you're moving around the Ishimura. Dead Space bundles all this together with text and audio logs, serving to directly expand upon the context of what's happening aboard the Ishimura. Everything is bad and everything has gone wrong, and overall everyone's having a terrible time is the kinda too long didn't read here. The vibe aboard the Ishimura is horrific, and the game leaves you with a constant sense of anxiety. A key part of a good horror game is the atmosphere, and Dead Space nails this by using its disturbing imagery, uncomfortable sound design, and morbid backstory to leave the player feeling uneasy at all times. I've played a few horror games in my time before I chose Dead Space, namely the Resident Evil franchise. Resident Evil was a very good survival horror game, obviously given its reputation, but the style of horror it uses is much different to that of Dead Space. I don't just mean that sci-fi horror is obviously very different to running from a bioweapon through the streets of Raccoon City, but the way Resident Evil scares you and portrays itself, which is similar to that of most horror games in my experience. These games utilize suspense immaculately, and they use it as a key aspect of the overall design. Things are slower paced, and there's generally less enemies, at least in the earlier half of the franchise, and not so much the more action-oriented Resi games like RE5. But you're always gulping as you peek past each corner. Dead Space is a lot more aggressive with its horror. There's still a lot of suspense in the game, don't get me wrong. This isn't something it forgoes. However, Dead Space is a much more stressful experience. Everything in Dead Space seems to move faster and chase you harder. Things burst into the room you're in, as I explained earlier, and they will be on your ass after that, and they really run after you. Dead Space feels a lot more overwhelming with its threats, and there's an almost constant sense of panic as I was playing. Rather than clutching your controller and peeking around corners, you're frantically trying to race through a hallway, whilst 3 different necromorphs all burst into the room and come after you. And in my experience, they almost run as fast as you do. Dead Space also encourages much more aggressive player behavior than other horror games, mainly with how you dispatch the necros. They are varied and fast, and they hurt, but so is Isaac, and he can pack a punch as well, which is great in the situation you're in. With your multitude of weapons, you can definitely tear necromorphs to shreds, and the game encourages this with its limb-ripping tech as a way to cripple and take the necromorphs out of action. Except it doesn't really, because once they're dismembered, they still need to be killed, but it's made a lot easier once their arms, legs, and whatever the hell you want to call them are ripped off. The point I'm trying to make is that Dead Space is very different to other survival horrors, obviously, but the style of gameplay in Dead Space is significantly more aggressive and overall more stressful than its more calculated competition, like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, which are also pillars of the survival horror genre. Dead Space takes a much more radical approach, and walks the line between aggressive action shooter that always has you on your toes moving from point A to point B, and suspenseful survival horror that wants you to carefully and methodically move through the Ishimura. And this is a gameplay balance you're going to have to learn to adapt to. You know what's scarier than zombie monsters?
Space!
Space is a very real and very scary mass of nothingness that doesn't get utilized in horror games very much or very rarely well. Space can be very terrifying, in a cosmic existential dread kind of way. If you misstep in space, you float off into infinity forever, or you freeze to death, or you run out of oxygen, or you fall into a black hole or be consumed by some kind of Cthulhu adjacent cosmic monster. Whilst most of this isn't relevant to the space sections of Dead Space, I'm just trying to emphasize that the very concept of space is daunting on its own. Space isn't your friend, and it definitely wants to hurt you. More relevant to how Dead Space uses, well, space for horror, you'll find plenty of the gameplay sections that take place entirely in space, or transition from inside the Ishimura with its terrible necromorphs that want to kill you, to outside in space with its terrible necromorphs that want to kill you. Using space as a gameplay mechanic, Dead Space can get a bit disorienting, as you now have to change the very way you move and combat the necros in space itself. Not only can you float around whichever way you want or from whichever angle you desire, whether it be upside down or horizontally or whatever zero-G allows, the necromorphs can do this too. Whilst doing the space and zero-G sections of the game, necromorphs will fling themselves towards you with great momentum, flying from somewhere, in my experience, outside your peripheral vision to swipe and gnaw on your rig. The space sections also utilize the atmosphere, or lack thereof, to further agitate you. The space sections ironically feel very claustrophobic, despite the absolute absence of anything around you whatsoever. At least to me, and there's this constant crushing feeling that I would probably more compare to being underwater. A very deep pressure that's all around you. The silence is deafening when in space, but not in Dead Space, unfortunately. The game's just not as quiet as it should be during the space sections, and I know I compared it to being underwater before, and it really shouldn't sound like that, but I digress. I definitely can accept the little gameplay advantage of hearing just what's shrieking in the distance. That said, there is a muted, anxious kind of breathing noise that reminds you to keep freaking out at all times whilst you float around, which leads me to mention that you are also always on a time limit when in space, as your oxygen is limited. You can find refills as consumables in your inventory or positioned around the level for single-use refills, as if the necromorphs, one specific boss battle, and the general uneasiness of being in space weren't already enough. You are under constant time pressure of running out of air. The space segments of the game can be quite fun and unique, genuinely something I haven't experienced before in a game. But, I personally haven't played anything like Mass Effect or Alien Isolation just yet, so I can't draw those comparisons. My point is, Dead Space is my frame of reference here, and I enjoy it. These expertly crafted segments are equally as stressful and anxiety-inducing as the sections aboard the Ishimura itself, and that's coming from someone who isn't necessarily afraid of space itself in real life. I can only imagine how different this experience would be to someone who has astrophobia, which is the fear of space. I've not played the original Dead Space trilogy, and frankly, I don't have any intention to. The remake is, at least to my knowledge, a faithful recreation of the original that doesn't go out of its way to change too many things. The gameplay is polished, the graphics and visuals are bumped up for the modern age, and the voice acting is superb. From what I researched online, from people who did actually play the original, the movement is updated to better match the later games in the series, and feel more fluid, sanding off the first game in the series' rougher edges that these games tend to have compared to their sequels. The voice acting seems to be the most dramatic change, as Isaac isn't a voice protagonist in the original Dead Space 1. The voice acting adds a very obvious layer of depth to Isaac as a character, and I'm not discrediting the originals or its story, as the Dead Space remake keeps to the story itself, just adds a voice to the main character, and helps Isaac feel more relatable and expressive, which is great in a survival horror situation. I'm more invested in keeping Isaac alive when he's able to convey his emotions and personality to me through the story. I didn't want to touch on this too much as I want to make a separate video for horror game remakes, but my point is that this is an expertly crafted remake from people who cared enough to make the game feel faithful to the original, and in my opinion, surpass the original as the definitive way to play Dead Space. Granted, take that with a grain of salt, I haven't played the original, and if I'm being honest, I don't intend to after playing the remake, but I stand by my opinion that if someone is new to the series and curious to give Dead Space a try, then the remake is definitely the way to go. Now, having played the Dead Space remake and loved my time with it, in the only way you can love your time with an emotionally harrowing experience like Dead Space, naturally I'd be excited to move forward with the franchise. There are still 2 more mainline games that continue the Dead Space series, and at least from the word of mouth I've found over the years, the best is still yet to come. For years I've seen clips and segments of particularly Dead Space 2, from standard gameplay to scenes that must have been truly disturbing back in the days after this game released, such as the infamous eye surgery scene that can obviously only go right no matter how it goes down. I've heard some more mixed opinions about the 3rd game, but that's usually how these things go with famous horror series, such as Resident Evil 5 and 6, or the several missteps Silent Hill has made that almost put the series on ice forever. So all I have to do is bide my time and wait for the inevitable announcement that Dead Space 2 is being remade to align it better with the current gen, more higher quality experience that is the remake of the first game, right? Well, unfortunately not. For those new to the series like me, or veterans of the franchise who had their love revitalized by the remake, this news is a bitter pill to swallow. But there obviously won't be a remake of Dead Space 2, as confirmed by EA about 6 months ago in April this year. It was speculated that EA Motive would continue their work on the Dead Space remakes, with the 2nd game anticipated to come next, but as rumors started to swirl of a shift in priorities at Motive, EA, the publisher, not Motive themselves, would cancel the Dead Space 2 remake. This news would break shortly after, with industry insider Jeff Grubb initially telling the internet the bad news, before EA themselves would confirm this later. The reason for the cancellation? Well, EA pinned the blame on lackluster sales. It's often quite hard to find accurate sales numbers for any game unless the publishers themselves release that information, but from what I could find online, the Dead Space remake had sold 2 million copies as of at least April 2024, a year and 3 months after its launch. To put this in perspective, and again, this is not like super solid info, it's just working with what's available online, but the Silent Hill 2 remake has sold over 1 million copies already, as of this video's recording in November 2024, 1 month after its launch. And to mention, the Resident Evil remakes have gigantuan numbers, ranking between 8 million copies sold on the Resident Evil 4 remake, which released 2 months after this Dead Space game, and 14 million copies sold for 2019's Resident Evil 2 remake, which is one of the best games of all time. These numbers don't look great, especially not in an era of more expensive games and just general horror game supremacy, and remakes of horror games specifically being quite popular. But critically, Dead Space did very well for itself, receiving solid scores almost completely across the board, ranging from high 8s and 9s from leading sites, and the community itself was also fond of the remake. Although it seems the game just didn't do well enough to draw in the new audience until it was too late. I myself admittedly passed on the Dead Space remake until October of this year, 6 months after the second remake was publicly cancelled. It seems like it was just too little too late for Dead Space, unfortunately. EA Motive saw itself repurposed into 2 teams since then, one to act as support for the next Battlefield, which is interesting to say the least, and the other to continue work on EA's Iron Man game, which I imagine will probably repurpose some of their experience with Dead Space's rigged float controls from the Zero-G sections. So EA Motive at least survived in an era where lackluster sales can lead to a lot of jobs lost. Here's hoping that EA considers changing their stance in the future, but until then it looks like I'll have to consider the Xbox 360 versions to finish off the story. The Dead Space remake seems to be a victim of poor timing in my opinion. because you've got what is frankly a fantastic and polished game with an interesting narrative and thrilling gameplay that unfortunately failed to meet internal expectations. Those who played it seemed to love it all around, but there just wasn't enough of those people to justify EA continuing the series and fully bringing it back during what is a golden age of survival horror games, and more specifically survival horror remakes. I personally enjoyed my time with it, a lot in fact, and it definitely stands out from the rest of the remakes and modern horror titles that are only increasing in number and popularity. Dead Space manages to remain unique in a time where other games are doing similar concepts, like Alien Isolation, and continue to breathe new life into a franchise that has been dormant for over 10 years now. The Dead Space remake isn't groundbreaking, and it certainly isn't shaking up the industry and forcing Resident Evil to reconsider itself, but it is still a worthwhile experience and a must-play for anyone who loves the survival horror genre. Will I play the next 2 games? I'll be honest, it's a big maybe from me. I've tried the whole play the originals after the remake in the past, and I had a very mixed experience, at least with the Resident Evil series. Maybe I will, maybe I won't, who knows. But I'm content knowing that I played the best version of Dead Space 1, and I hope this video showcases it enough in a positive light that you consider playing it as well if you haven't. Or if you're a Dead Space fan who didn't try the remake for whatever reason, now's obviously the time. With all that said, thank you for watching this video, and please do like and subscribe if you haven't already. Let me know down below if you've played the Dead Space remake and its original and how you think it holds up in comparison. And please share this video with any of your friends interested in Dead Space. I do want to make a follow-up video to this that talks a bit more about other survival horror remakes like Silent Hill that I've been playing, so keep an eye out for that and expect to see Dead Space pop up in that video again. Thanks for watching, and peace out.